The year was 1879, and winter had fastened its teeth into the high country of the Wyoming Territory. The town of Red Hollow was little more than a scatter of wooden ribs exposed on the prairie, a place where the wind seemed to be born. Out here, on the edges of Bram Kincaid's property, the wind was the only constant. It scraped down from the long, bare spine of dry cedar bluff, a low, ceaseless moan that scoured the thin, granular snow from the ridges and piled it in drifts against the leafless thickets. The snow did not blanket the land. It merely sharpened its edges, revealing the black bones of the cedars and the iron-hard ruts of the wagon path. It was a cold that did not just chill the skin, but seemed to seek out the marrow. Beneath the Kincaid farmhouse, buried in the cold, unyielding earth, Ella Winhart lived in a silence that was deeper and more absolute than the winds. She was 19 years old. The air in the stone cellar was dead, heavy with the smell of damp rock, potato sprouts, and the faint, sour odor of the vinegar rags Bram's wife had once used to clean the shelves. A single kerosene lamp, its wick trimmed low to conserve fuel, burned on an overturned apple crate. It cast just enough light to make the shadows seem alive, huge and distorted, leaping across the weeping stone walls. Her hands were bound in front of her, not with leather cuffs, which might have been marginally kinder, but with rough-cut sisal twine. Bram Kincaid had pulled the knots tight. The fibers had long since broken the skin, and the raw, chafed flesh of her wrists wept a thin fluid that glued the twine to her. She had been down here for weeks. She thought the passage of time was marked only by the slice of gray light that appeared under the door when Bram came, once a day, to slide in a tin cup of water and a heel of stale bread. Bram was her legal guardian, her mother's sister's husband. He was a man who spoke of scripture in the town's meeting hall and practiced a quiet, methodical tyranny within his own fences. He had locked Elowin in the cellar because he claimed she was unnatural, a vessel for bad luck. The rumor had spread through Red Hollow like alkali dust. The heart girl, they whispered, was touched. She could hear things she ought not. She knew when a blizzard was massing over the mountains 2 days before the sky turned gray. She knew when the creek would rise. They mistook her sensitivity for something sinister. The truth was simpler. Elowin had been raised in the saddle, riding the high pastures with her father before he passed. He had taught her to read the world not with words, but with her body. She did not hear the devil. She felt the barometric pressure drop in her joints. She smelled the iron taint in the air that preceded a lightning strike. She understood the sudden, tense silence of the horses, the way they turned their backs to a wind that was not yet there. Her intuition was a living thing, honed sharp by a childhood spent listening to the earth. But Bram Kincaid cared nothing for her intuition, only for its usefulness as an excuse. His true motive lay on the crate next to the lamp, weighted down by a chunk of quartzite, a deed of transfer. The papers would sign over her inheritance, a seemingly useless patch of scrubland on the northern hill, land that held a secret Bram had spent a year confirming. A deep, reliable underground spring. Water in Wyoming was not just life, it was power. It was the blood of the land, and Bram Kincaid was a man consumed by thirst. He needed her signature. The cold, the dark, and the biting twine were his ink. Elowin sat huddled on a pile of burlap sacks, her mind adrift in the gray. Numb space between endurance and despair. She was tracing the intricate, map-like pattern of a mildew stain on the stone when a sound broke the stillness. It was not the familiar, dreaded scrape of Bram's boot on the wooden stairs above. It was a sharp, metallic crack, a sound of sudden fracture. She went rigid. The heavy, rust-caked padlock on the outside of the door, the one Bram always made a show of slamming shut, had just been broken. A thick silence flooded the cellar, heavier and more charged than the darkness. Then came the agonizing wooden groan of the heavy plank door being pulled outward. A rectangle of blue-white light shattered the gloom. It was the moon, riding high and cold over the snow. The light was so bright, so sudden, that it felt like a physical blow. Elowin cried out, a small, cracked sound. Throwing her bound hands up to shield her face, She scrambled backward, her shoulders hitting the damp stone wall. A man's silhouette filled the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and seemed to drink the light, leaving only his shape. He did not move for a long count, a statue of the night. He was letting her eyes adjust, giving her time. Elowen lowered her hands slowly, squinting into the glare. She could make out details now. A heavy, dark coat that fell past his knees, a low-brimmed hat pulled down, shadowing his face. This was not Bram. This was not one of his hired hands, Dirk Mallory or Huck Veers. She knew him, though she had never spoken to him. Everyone in Red Hollow knew of him. Colt Rafferty, the owner of the Coyote Gate Ranch, a spread that bordered Kincaid's land to the west. A man in his 30-somethings, maybe older, who lived a life of deliberate solitude. He was known for his prize horse breaking and for speaking only when there was no other option. He took one step down onto the stone stair, his boots making no sound. He had to duck his head slightly to clear the low beam. His eyes, now visible beneath the brim, scanned the cellar. He took in the bucket in the corner, the meager rations on the crate, the damp sacks she slept on. And finally, her. His gaze was steady, assessing. It held no shock, no outrage, and, worst of all, no pity. It just held fact. When he spoke, his voice was just as she had imagined it, low, quiet, with a rough texture, like a hand run over dry wood. "I've come to take you out of here," he said. His eyes moved to the dancing, distorted shadow her small form cast on the wall. "Nobody belongs in the dark." Elowen just stared. Her throat felt sealed shut with disuse. The name of this man was a stone in her mind. A rescuer or just a different kind of danger, the light from the open door hurt her eyes. But the absolute blackness of the night behind him was a terrifying, infinite void. In the cellar, she knew the dimensions of her prison. She knew the enemy. She pressed herself harder against the wall, a movement that pulled the sisal twine taut, sending a fresh sting of fire up her arms. The back of her thin calico dress was torn, and the rough stone bit into her skin. Colt Rafferty did not rush her. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who gentles wild things for a living. He recognized the look in her eyes, the cornered animal, ready to fight or break itself, trying to flee. He unbuttoned his heavy woolen greatcoat. It was dark wool, worn but clean, and it looked impossibly warm. He shrugged it off his broad shoulders. He took one more slow step, holding the coat out. Elowen flinched, sucking in a sharp, sudden breath. He stopped instantly. He did not try to touch her. He simply stepped close enough to drape the heavy coat over her trembling shoulders. The warmth was immediate, shocking. It enveloped her, heavy as armor, smelling of wood smoke, clean leather, and the sharp, sterile scent of the frozen night air. It was the first human kindness she had felt in months, and it almost broke her. He stepped back, reclaiming no space, making no demands. He merely held out his bare hand, palm up. It was a large hand, the knuckles scarred, the palm laced with the calloused lines of hard work. It was not a command. It was an invitation. As she stared at that hand, weighing the known hell of the cellar against the unknown risk of the man, a new sound cut the night. Shouts from the backyard, the frantic, heavy thud of boots on the frozen path leading to the stables, then the distinct, panicked thunder of unshod hoofbeats, scattering fast into the darkness. Colt Rafferty's expression did not change, but she saw his head tilt, listening. He had been busy before he came to the cellar. He had visited the stable first, where Bram's two hired hands, Mallory and Veers, were meant to be posted. Colt had neutralized them in the simplest, most effective way possible in this territory. He had pulled the pins on the stable doors and sent their prized saddle horses galloping free into the snow-covered hills. A man on foot in a Wyoming winter is a man occupied. The diversion was bought. The time was now. Colt's hand remained steady, solid as the stone around her. Elowen looked at the weeping wall, her prison. She looked at the deed of transfer on the crate, the paper that represented her death warrant. She looked at the silent man who stood in the moonlight, offering nothing but the outside. She took a breath. The clean, cold air burned her lungs, a painful reminder of what it was to be alive. It was not a decision made with courage. It was a decision made with instinct. The same instinct that told her the storm was coming. Her bound hands were clumsy, useless for grasping. She shifted her weight, the burlap sacks rustling beneath her. She put her raw, chafed wrists together and laid them across his open palm. His fingers closed around her wrists. His grip was firm, yet careful not to press on the broken skin. He did not pull her. He waited, his strength a solid presence for her to lean against. Elowen Hart pushed herself off the wall. She rose from the filth and the damp, wrapped in a stranger's warmth, and took the first step up the stone stairs. She walked out of the darkness that had held her, and into the cold, blinding judgment of the moon, igniting the first spark of a blaze that would soon challenge the very soul of Red Hollow. He pulled her up the last 2 steps into the freezing air. The shock of the cold was violent. It snatched the breath from her lungs and turned the relative warmth of the cellar into a distant memory. The moonlight on the snow was so bright it was like stepping onto a landscape of crushed glass. Colt did not speak. There was no time for reassurance. He still had her wrists in his grasp, and he half led, half pulled her around the corner of the farmhouse, toward a dense shadow that separated Kincaid's yard from the open range. The shadow was his mare, Marigold, a dark buckskin tethered to a low-hanging pine bough. She stood perfectly still, a testament to her training, her breath pluming in the still air. He stopped in front of the horse. Elowen was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sudden, violent transition. Her body, weakened by weeks of confinement and poor food, was struggling to obey. "His hands," Colt said, his voice a low rumble. He released her wrists and drew a knife from a sheath on his belt. The blade caught the moonlight, a sliver of ice. Elowen flinched, pulling her arms back against her chest. "Easy," he said. He did not move the knife toward her. He just waited. She understood. She extended her hands. He took her left wrist. He was careful, turning her hand so the flat of the blade faced her skin. He slid the knife between the raw flesh and the biting sisal, and with one quick, upward pull, the rope parted. He did the same for the right. The severed twine, stiff with her own dried blood, fell into the snow. The release of pressure was a new, sharp agony. "Now," he said, sheathing the knife. "Up." He put his hands on her waist. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her as if she were a child and set her sideways in the saddle. Before she could find her balance, he had untied the mare and swung up behind her, his body a solid wall at her back. He pulled his heavy coat, which was still draped over her, more tightly around them both. "Hold the horn," he commanded. Her numb, trembling fingers found the cold leather of the saddle horn. Marigold moved, not into a gallop, which would make too much noise, but into a quick, ground-eating trot. They slipped from the shadow of the pine and angled away from the farmhouse, heading not for the road, but for the wild, broken country to the west. They plunged into a stand of white-barked birches. The trees grew thick, their branches laden with snow. As they passed, the mare's movement shook the limbs, and small avalanches of cold powder rained down, dusting their shoulders and hair. It was a cold, white, silent passage. Colt guided the horse with his knees, his arms a cage around Elowen. Behind them, at the Kincaid house, the pursuit was just beginning. Dirk Mallory, his temper already frayed from chasing loose horses in the dark, kicked open the door to the tack room. "Where in the hell is Rafferty?" he growled. Huck Veers, slower and thicker, lumbered toward the cellar. He had seen the broken padlock lying in the snow. He lit a lantern, his hands clumsy. "Bram!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Bram, you better come see this!" Bram Kincaid strode out of the house, his face dark. He grabbed the lantern from Huck and descended the stone steps. The cellar was empty. The air was frigid from the open door. On the damp stone floor, gleaming wet in the lantern light, lay the two short, severed lengths of sisal twine. Bram stared at them. He did not curse. He did not yell. A terrible, frozen calm settled over his features. He looked at the coiled rope, then at the deed of transfer sitting on the crate. Untouched, he turned, ascending the stairs slowly. When he emerged, he looked west, toward the dark line of ridges that marked the boundary of the Coyote Gate Ranch. He took the girl, Bram said, his voice flat and deadly. He took my water. Colt kept the mare in the trees for as long as he could, then angled down into the shallow, winding bed of a frozen creek. The ice was a ribbon of pale blue in the moonlight, slick and treacherous. Marigold's shod hooves clicked and skated, searching for purchase. "This is better," Colt whispered close to Elowen's ear. "It leaves no tracks." Elowen was shivering so hard her teeth ached. The coat was a godsend, but the cold had found its way into her bones. Yet, she did not slump. She sat rigid, her back straight, her senses stretched taut. Listening. She was listening not with her ears, but with her entire body, just as her father had taught her. Marigold took a hesitant step. The ice beneath her hoof emitted a high, sharp groan, a sound of pressure threatening to fracture. Before Colt could react, Elowen made a soft clicking sound with her tongue and pressed her left hand against the mare's neck, pushing her gently toward the right bank. "There," she breathed. The word, a puff of steam. "The ice is thicker by the rock." Colt pulled the mare back slightly. Astonished, he had barely heard the ice shift. He looked at the girl. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted, as if listening to a distant song. She felt the subtle change in vibration through the horse's body, understood the subtle shift in the wind that meant the bank was hollowed out on one side but solid on the other. He nodded, guiding Marigold where she had indicated. The mare found solid footing. Colt Rafferty looked at the small, frail woman in his arms, and a new understanding settled on him. The town said she was touched. They were right, but not in the way they meant. She was not unhinged. She was connected to the wind, the ground, the very bones of the territory, in a way he had never seen. They rode for another hour, following the winding, trackless path of the creek, until Colt finally urged Marigold up a steep, snowy bank and onto his own land. The difference was immediate. Here, long, double rows of pine had been planted as windbreaks, and the snow lay in even, undisturbed drifts instead of the scoured, wind-blasted patches on Kincaid's property. Coyote Gate Ranch came into view over a low rise. It was not a ranch built on hope, but on persistence. The log house was square and solid, its chimney trailing a thin, straight line of white smoke against the dark sky. The barn was massive, painted a dark red, and the stables beside it were low and tight. The entire spread was orderly, clean, and built to withstand the wind. It was the world of a man who saved his words and spent his energy on his work. He rode them directly to the house, sliding from the saddle before the mare had fully stopped. His hands went to Elowen's waist. "Easy now." He lifted her down. The moment her boots touched the ground, her legs, which had been locked in place for over an hour, gave way. She crumpled. He caught her, lifting her easily, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. He carried her the last few feet to the porch and kicked the door open with his boot. The inside was one large, clean room. A massive cast-iron stove dominated the far wall, radiating a deep, bone-soaking heat. The air smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and saddle soap. He crossed the floor and set her gently on a simple wooden stool by the fire. Elowen sat there, trembling, overwhelmed by the sudden, profound heat. She stared at the flames, her eyes wide. Colt did not fuss over her. He moved with a quiet economy. He took a kettle from the stove and poured steaming water into a tin basin. He added cold water from a bucket. He retrieved a small, brown bottle of carbolic acid and a clean linen cloth from a shelf. He knelt in front of her. "Let me see to your hands," he said. Elowen pulled her hands deeper into the sleeves of his coat. She was ashamed of the filth, the raw, weeping wounds. He just waited. holding the cloth. "They'll fester if we don't." Slowly, painfully, she extended her hands. He took her left hand. His touch was impossibly gentle for a man whose hands were so scarred and calloused. He dipped the cloth in the warm, stinging water and began to clean the chafed, broken skin. Elowen hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not pull away. She watched the fire, tears welling in her eyes, not from the pain, but from this, from the simple, methodical act of care. It was an intimacy so foreign it was almost unbearable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. He just nodded, his attention fixed on his task. He cleaned both wrists thoroughly, then dried them and wrapped them in clean strips of linen. When he was finished, he stood up. He walked to the corner of the room where a cot was folded against the wall. He brought it over and set it up close to the stove, on the opposite side of the hearth from his own simple bed. He unfolded 3 thick wool blankets and laid them on top. He turned back to her. She was still watching the fire, as if it were the first she had ever seen. He laid down the law of his house. "You can stay here as long as you have need," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "The door is not locked from the outside. No one will touch you here, not unless you wish it." Elowen looked up at him. She saw no pity in his face, just a statement of fact, a boundary, clean and sharp as a new-cut piece of timber. This, she understood. This was safety. "I need to see to my mare," he said, pulling on his gloves. "There is stew in the pot on the stove. Eat." He turned and went to the door. "Wait," she said. Her voice was barely a rasp. He stopped, his hand on the latch, and looked back. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room. She spotted a nub of charcoal near the fireplace, used for marking logs. She picked it up. Her hands were stiff and sore, but she managed. On a smooth piece of pine kindling, she wrote one word, the letters shaky. "Elowen." She held the piece of wood out to him. Colt walked back. He took the wood from her, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at the name, studying it. He pronounced it slowly, carefully, giving each syllable its proper weight. "Elowen." She gave a single, small nod. Hearing her name spoken aloud, correctly, felt like being given back a piece of herself. He nodded once in return. "Elowen." He slipped the piece of wood into his shirt pocket, over his heart. He left, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving her alone with the heat and the silence. Outside, the wind howled, and from the ridge, the high, barking call of a fox cut the night. Colt walked to the stable. He rubbed down Marigold, checked her legs, gave her fresh water and a measure of oats, his movements unhurried. When he was done, he pulled the heavy stable door shut and slid the thick, iron-banded wooden bar into place. He stood there for a moment in the darkness, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, toward the land that belonged to Bram Kincaid. He knew this was not over. Bram would not let her go. He would not let the water go. Colt's hand rested on the solid, locked bar. He had brought her out of the dark. Now he would have to keep the dark from getting her. She woke before the light. For a disoriented second, the absolute stillness terrified her, the silence pressing in. It was the silence of the cellar. She gasped, her hands flying to her bandaged wrists, and the sharp sting of the carbolic salve brought her back. She was not in the dark. She was on a cot, wrapped in 3 layers of thick wool. A dull red glow came from the air vents of the cast-iron stove. The room was warm. She sat up. Colt Rafferty was asleep on his own bed, a still, dark shape under his blankets. He slept as he did everything else, without sound. Elowen slipped her feet to the cold wooden floor. His coat, which she had used as a 4th blanket, fell away. She was wearing a pair of his woolen socks and a long flannel undershirt he had left on the stool for her while she slept. It was ridiculously large. The sleeves rolled up 6 times, but it was clean and smelled of lye soap. She moved with a lifetime of practice in not making noise. She added 2 small logs to the stove. her movements precise, the latch clicking shut with only a soft metallic snick. She found the coffee grinder and the tin of beans. Grinding them was the loudest thing in the room, a rhythmic, abrasive crunching. Colt did not stir. She put the kettle on to boil, and, for the first time in what felt like another life, she stood by a fire and simply waited for water to get hot, when the sky outside had turned from black to a deep, bruised purple. Colt moved. He sat up in one fluid motion, fully awake, his eyes finding her in the dim light. She was standing by the stove, holding 2 steaming tin cups. He gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. She brought 1 cup over, setting it on the small crate he used as a bedside table. She did not meet his eyes. She took her own cup and retreated to the stool by the hearth. They drank in silence. The coffee was black, bitter, and scalding hot. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When the sun finally broke the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, Colt stood and pulled on his boots. He was headed for the stables. Elowen set her cup down, grabbed his heavy coat, and followed him out. The cold hit her, but this time it was different. It was clean. It was air she was choosing to breathe. The stable was warm, the air thick with the sweet, dusty smell of hay and the living warmth of animals. Colt moved down the line, checking on his stock, his hands running over legs and flanks, his voice a low, encouraging rumble. Elowen hung back, a shadow in the doorway. A young, gray colt in the last stall, barely a yearling, shied as Colt approached, bumping the wooden partition. "Easy, Sparrow," Colt murmured, holding out his hand. The colt snorted, unconvinced. Elowen stepped forward slowly. "He favors his left foreleg," she said. Her voice was thin, rusty. Colt stopped, looking at her. "He does. And he does not like to be approached from that side. He thinks you cannot see him, so he must see you." Colt studied the animal, then looked at Elowen. He stepped back, moving to the colt's right side. "All right, Sparrow, I'm over here." The colt's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered and straightened. He lowered his head and nudged Colt's glove. Elowen moved into the stall, not toward the horse, but toward the feed bin. She scooped a handful of dry oats and held them low, on her flat palm. The horse, Sparrow, turned his head. He looked at her, his large, dark eyes curious. He stepped, putting his weight on the left foreleg with a wince, and lipped the oats from her hand. His muzzle was velvety soft. She let her other hand, the bandaged one, rest on his neck. "You're all right," she whispered, her breath clouding. "You just know the ground is hard. You're smarter than the rest." The colt leaned his head against her chest, a profound gesture of trust. Colt Rafferty watched the two of them, the half-starved girl and the nervous colt, recognize each other. He said nothing, just turned and continued his chores. Elowen stayed with the horse, pitching hay, her movements growing more confident, her body remembering the simple, healing rhythm of work. Later that morning, Colt was mending a section of fence on the western perimeter. The wind was relentless, a high, thin whine that cut through wool and flesh. Elowen was with him, holding the heavy wooden mallet and the tin of staples. She had insisted on coming. The small log house, while safe, still had 4 walls. She needed the sky. Colt worked with a brutal efficiency, stretching the new wire taut, sinking the staples with 2 perfectly placed blows. He moved to the next post, testing it with his weight. It was solid. He moved to the next. Elowen, standing back, tilted her head. She was listening to the wind, just as she had in the cellar. But here, the wind spoke. "Not that one," she said, her voice stronger in the open air. Colt paused, mallet in hand. "The next one, the tall one. It's soft at the base." Colt looked at the post. It looked identical to the others. A solid piece of lodgepole pine, weathered gray. He walked over, grabbed the top, and shoved it hard. The post gave way with a wet, splintering crack. The entire base, hidden 2 feet below the snowline, nothing but damp, pulpy rot. Had he stretched wire on it, it would have failed by the next blizzard. Colt stared at the broken post, then back at Elowen. She was watching the ground, avoiding his gaze, as if embarrassed by the knowledge. "How did you know?" he asked. She pointed to her ear. "The wind," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. "It whistled through the top. The others just hum. That one. It rattled, like a hollow bone." He pulled the rotten stump from the ground. Saying nothing, he took the mallet from her hands and began digging a new hole, his expression thoughtful. They were walking the low ridge back to the house, the sun high and weak. When Elowen stopped again, she was looking down into a small, scrub-choked draw. "What is it?" Colt asked, scanning the brush for a coyote or a stray calf. She pointed. "There, the snow." He saw nothing, just drifts, rock, and dormant sagebrush. "No," she insisted, walking down the slope. "It's melted." She led him to a spot where, in a small, 5-foot circle, the ground was bare and damp. The snow had been eaten away from beneath. A thin, almost invisible wisp of steam rose from the dark, wet earth. Colt knelt. He touched the mud. It was warm. "A spring," he said, his voice tight with surprise. "A hot one." This ranch had been in his family for 30 years. No one had ever known this was here. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. This girl, who had been locked away for being unlucky, had, in one morning, soothed his most difficult colt, found his weakest fence post, and discovered a source of warm water on his land. He took his knife and cut a deep, deliberate blaze into the trunk of the nearest pine, marking the spot. Word, in Red Hollow, traveled faster than a horse. It had been 3 days, in the partitioned-off corner of the mercantile that served as the post office. The whispers were loud enough to be conversation. "Bram Kincaid is fit to be tied," one rancher said, sorting through his mail. "Swears that quiet fella Rafferty just rode onto his land and snatched the girl." "Snatched her from where?" the postmaster asked, leaning over the counter. "Right out of the cellar. Bram had her locked up. For her own protection, he says." "Protection?" scoffed a woman in a heavy shawl. "I've heard the stories. That girl is touched, unnatural. But Bram Kincaid, he's a hard man. He's not the kind to be a guardian for charity." Reverend Ivan Pike, a tall, gaunt man whose piety was a heavy, suffocating blanket, cleared his throat. "We must not judge. Brethren, Mr. Kincaid is a God-fearing man, burdened with a difficult ward. He is distraught." Bram himself entered, his face a mask of cold fury. He slapped a paper onto the counter. "A telegram. To the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. I am formally charging Colt Rafferty with kidnapping and theft of property." The postmaster's eyes went wide. "Kidnapping? Bram, that's a hanging offense. He took what was under my legal care," Bram said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I will have her back, and I will have him stand trial for it." The Reverend put a placating hand on Bram's arm. "Brother Kincaid, perhaps a quieter solution. Let us ride out, as men of God and community, and retrieve the girl. Let us settle this before the law brings trouble." Bram shook his head, his eyes like chips of flint. "The time for quiet is over. Rafferty has crossed a line. He will find out what the law in Red Hollow says about thieves." That evening, the silence in Colt's cabin was different. It was no longer the silence of two strangers. It was the silence of two people working together, a shared quiet. Colt was mending a bridle, his hands moving with practiced skill. Elowen was sitting by the fire, mending the tear in the back of her calico dress with a needle and thread from Colt's kit. Her bandaged hands were clumsy, but she persisted. Colt finished his work. He hung the bridle on a peg. He sat on the stool opposite her. "We need to talk," he said. Elowen looked up, her fingers stopping their work. "Bram will come, not just his men. He will bring the law. He will say I stole you. He will say you are unwell." Elowen's eyes darkened. She looked at the floor. "You will have to speak," he said gently. "They will need to hear your voice." She flinched, her hand going to her throat. She shook her head. Colt considered this. He thought of his old friend. Orson Vale, the blacksmith in town, who had lost his hearing and his voice to a fever. Orson had taught Colt that words were not the only way to tell the truth. Colt held up his right hand. He tapped his first 2 fingers against his chin. Water. He signed. Then he made a fist. His thumb extended and moved it in a small circle. Horse or stable? Elowen watched, her expression intent. He then put his flat hand to his lips and moved it forward, palm up. Thank you. He repeated the signs. Water, stable, thank you. Elowen put down her sewing. She tapped her fingers on her chin. Water. She made the fist. Stable. She brought her hand from her lips. Forward. Thank you. Colt nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. She then pointed out the window, at the dark, bruised sky. She picked up the piece of charcoal she had used for her name. On the hearthstone, she drew a low, heavy cloud, shaped like the belly of a fish. She drew an arrow pointing from the west. Then she drew a series of quick, slanting lines beneath it. Colt studied the drawing. Gray-bellied clouds, he said aloud, deciphering her meaning. Rain, with a west wind. She nodded, smiling, a real smile, not the ghost of one. He looked at her, really looked at her, and his rough voice fumbled as he tried her name again. L-O-Owen, L-Owen. He said it as if it were a foreign word, the syllables catching. A small sound escaped her, a short, breathy puff of air. It was a laugh. It was rusty, quiet, and gone as soon as it appeared. But it was a laugh. It startled her as much as it did him. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. He simply looked at her, the corners of his own mouth softening. That night, she dreamed. She was back in the cellar, the walls weeping. The door was at the top of the stairs, a heavy, dark slab of wood, She was climbing, her bound hands reaching, but the steps were slick with ice, and she kept sliding back down, back into the suffocating, silent dark. She woke with a muffled cry, sitting bolt upright on the cot. Her heart was hammering. The cabin was pitch black. The fire burned down to embers. Bram, she whispered, the name a curse. She was trembling. She heard a sound from the other side of the room, a boot scraping the floor. A shadow moved. Colt, he was getting up. She flinched, pulling the blankets to her chin. The law of his house. No one will touch you here. But he did not approach her. He moved to the stove. She heard the metallic scrape of the kettle, the pour of water. He walked not to her bed, but to the stool beside it, and set down a tin cup. It's just warm water, he said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. You're safe. Go back to sleep. He turned and went back to his own bed. Elowen stared into the darkness where he had been. She reached out a trembling hand and found the cup. It was warm, solid. She wrapped her fingers around it. She listened to the sound of the wind outside, the sound of the man breathing on the other side of the room. She drank the water, and for the first time in more than a month, she fell back into a sleep that was not a prison. When the pale gray light of morning came, Colt rose first. He pulled on his boots and coat and went to the door. When he opened it, a blast of cold air swirled into the room. He stood on the porch, motionless. Elowen, stirring from the warmth, got up and went to see what he was looking at. She stood beside him in the doorway. On the rough planks of the porch, in a skiff of snow that had blown against the wall during the night, were footprints. They were not Colt's small, neat boot prints. They were large, wide, and deep, made by a heavy man. The tracks led from the corner of the house, stopped directly in front of the cabin's main window, lingered there, and then retreated back into the snow-covered yard, disappearing toward the ridge. Someone had been there, standing in the dark, watching them. The tracks were 3 days old, half filled with new snow, but they had changed the air of the ranch. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Colt worked with his back to the house, but his gaze constantly scanned the ridge. Elowen, who had lived by sensing threats, felt the shift like a drop in temperature. She stayed close to the house, her body a coiled spring. The confrontation came not at dawn, but in the hard, flat light of mid-afternoon, when the world was shadowless and exposed. It started with the sound of horses, too many of them, moving too fast. Colt was coming from the corral, his rifle held loosely in his left hand, down by his side. Elowen, who had been scattering feed for the chickens, froze. She saw them first, silhouetted against the bright snow of the eastern ridge. 4 riders. No, 5. Go inside, Colt said, his voice not rising, but cutting through the wind. Lock the door. She did not argue. She ran to the house, her boots slipping, and bolted the heavy wooden bar. She went straight to the window, the one beside the hearth, pushing the linen curtain aside just an inch. The riders stopped at the main gate, a solid, 5-barred structure of pine that marked the entrance to the ranch yard. Bram Kincaid was at the front, his face rigid with a cold, righteous fury. Beside him sat Dirk Mallory, his wolfish grin in place. Huck Veers was there, looking uneasy, his bulk spilling over his saddle, and there were 2 new men, hard cases Elowen had never seen, unshaven and wearing worn-out buffalo coats, their rifles resting brazenly across their laps. Colt Rafferty walked slowly, stopping a good 20 yards inside his own gate. He did not touch the rifle. Just let it hang. Rafferty, Bram called, his voice tight. You are harboring my legal ward. I am here by rights to take her back. She's not your prisoner. Bram, Colt said, his voice carrying easily on the cold air. She's a free woman. She came of her own will. She is unwell. Bram spat, the lie coming easily. She is confused. You took advantage of her condition. I have the papers that prove my guardianship. And I have the papers that prove your motive, Colt said. He reached inside his coat. A slow, deliberate movement. The 2 strangers tensed, their hands tightening on their rifles. Colt pulled out not a weapon, but a small, leather-bound book. It was the public ledger from the Red Hollow post office and mercantile, where all major debts and contracts were registered for the county. Colt opened it to a page he had marked with a twig. It says right here, he said, his voice as flat and hard as a shovel blade, that you, Bram Kincaid, owe the freighting company in Cheyenne over $800 for failed seed speculation, due in 2 weeks. It also states the collateral you offered was 1 parcel of land known as Hart Hill, land that is not, and never has been, yours to offer. Bram's face, which had been pale with anger, went dark with a rush of blood. Huck Veers shifted, looking at the ground. This was news to him. You have no right, Bram began, his voice losing its righteous edge. I have the right of any citizen to look at a public ledger. Colt said, You're not a guardian. You're a thief, desperate to pay a debt. You locked her in a cellar to steal her land, to steal her water. From the window, Elowen watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from a cold, sharp memory. Her eyes were fixed on Dirk Mallory. He was bored with the talk of ledgers. He had taken his knife from its sheath and was cleaning his fingernails with the tip. She saw the handle. It was carved from a piece of antler, stained dark, and whittled into the shape of a coiled rattlesnake. The image hit her like a fist. She was in the cellar again, the darkness absolute. The door opens, but it is not Colt. It is Dirk, his breath smelling of stale whiskey. He holds the lantern high, and in the other hand, he holds that knife. He presses the flat, cold blade against her throat. Just sign the paper, girl. It is so much easier than the alternative, a signature or a scar. She pressed her forehead against the freezing glass of the cabin window. The cold a sharp anchor to the present. Her breathing was shallow. She watched Dirk test the point of the blade with his thumb. Talk is cheap. Rafferty, Dirk Mallory called out, his voice a lazy drawl. He slid the knife back into its sheath. We're here for the girl. You're 1 man. We're 5. And we have the law on our side. The law, Bram said, recovering, is what I am here to uphold. Now, stand aside, or I will have you arrested for obstruction. Then go get the law, Colt said calmly. Go back to Red Hollow and get Deputy Maeve Hollister. Get a territorial judge. I will be happy to show them this ledger. I will be happy to let Elowen speak for herself in a proper court. This was a gamble. Maeve Hollister was new, a young woman given the deputy's star mostly because no one else wanted the job. But she was known to be honest, which made her unpredictable. Bram knew he was trapped. A public court, with that ledger as evidence, would ruin him. His piety was his only currency in town. One of the strangers in the buffalo coat spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. We ain't got time for this. This here is your last chance, rancher. Send out the girl, or we'll burn that barn of yours to the ground, with your prize horses inside. The threat hung in the air, smelling of smoke and violence. The barn was Colt's life. It was his bloodline. Elowen saw Colt's right hand move. It did not go for the rifle. It settled, lightly, on the worn wooden grip of the revolver holstered on his hip. His thumb rested on the hammer. It was not a threat. It was a promise. You set one spark to my property, Colt said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. And I will not wait for the deputy. This is my land, and you are trespassing with intent. The 5 men looked at the one. The wind howled, the only sound in the sudden, terrible silence. The 2 strangers looked at Bram. They were hired for muscle, but this was not the easy job they had been promised. Colt Rafferty was not moving. Bram stared at Colt, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical thing. He had miscalculated. He had thought the rancher's silence meant weakness. He saw now that it meant patience. This is not over, Rafferty, Bram said, pulling his horse's head around. He looked past Colt, his eyes locking onto the cabin window where he knew she must be hiding. He spoke to her, a low, venomous whisper that the wind carried straight to the porch. That girl belongs in the cellar. It's where the unnatural things go, and I will see her put back in it. He spurred his horse, and the 5 of them turned, galloping back the way they came, their retreat a storm of kicked-up snow and curses. Elowen let out the breath she had been holding. Her knees felt weak. She slid down the wall, her hand clutched tight in the fabric of her borrowed shirt, right over her heart. She had not backed away from the window. She had not let him see her flinch. The sun set, the cold deepened. Neither of them spoke of the confrontation. There was nothing to say. The threat of fire was real. That night, they did not eat by the stove. They took lanterns to the massive barn. While Colt checked the animals, Elowen walked the perimeter, her eyes sharp, looking for any sign of tampering. The main door, Colt said, his voice muffled. He was examining the heavy sliding door. If they come back with torches, this is where they'll start. He brought tools and a stack of heavy oak planks. For the next 2 hours, they worked together in the cold, lantern-lit space. She held the planks steady while he drilled and bolted, reinforcing the door from the inside, adding a new, thicker crossbar. The air was filled with the scrape of the auger and the metallic ratchet of the wrench. Their shadows, cast by the 2 lanterns, stretched huge and distorted across the hay bales and up the high rafters. 2 giants working in silence. He was testing the new bar, putting his full weight against it. It held firm. My mother, he said, his voice startling in the quiet. He stepped back, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. She was a quiet woman. Grew up in the high mountains. She did not like towns, did not like chatter. Elowen stopped, watching him. He rarely spoke of himself. She taught me how to work, how to listen to the horses. And she taught me that silence is its own kind of oath. You don't make promises you don't intend to keep, and you don't waste your breath on men who only listen to the sound of their own voices. Like Bram. He looked at Elowen. You have that same quiet. It's not emptiness. It's full of listening. Elowen looked down at her hands, the bandages a stark white in the yellow light. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to explain. She held up her hand, palm out, and shook her head. No. Then she pointed to her ear and shook her head again. Not deaf. She touched her throat, then made a fist, a motion of capture. Then she pointed toward the east, toward Bram's land. Forced silent. Colt watched her hands, his expression softening with a profound, terrible understanding. He nodded slowly. He had rescued her from a stone cellar, but she had been a prisoner long before that. They picked up the lanterns to go. The work was done. They stood at the small side door of the stable, the one that led back to the house. The night was brilliant, the moon a sharp crescent, the stars so bright they looked like holes punched in the sky. Elowen stepped out first, into the deep, blue-white snow. Colt followed, pulling the door shut behind him. He reached past her to slide the outer bolt. His arm brushed her shoulder. She was standing very close. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. He was a solid shadow against the starlight. "You're cold," he said. He could see her shivering. "I'm all right," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He did not move away. His hand, the one that had just slid the bolt, was still near her face. He could feel the small puff of her breath, a cloud of warmth in the freezing air. His own breath mingled with hers. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes, which were wide and steady, watching him. A current passed between them, sudden and strong as a summer lightning strike. It was the shared danger, the shared work, the confessions in the dark. He lifted his hand, his glove rough, his knuckles grazing her cheek. She did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, her eyes closing. It was a moment of absolute stillness, a pause in the wind, a pause in the fear. He lowered his head. She rose on her toes, and then a horse screamed. It was not a nicker of greeting. It was a high, shrill, terrified sound that tore the night in two. Colt was moving before the sound died. He pulled Elowen behind him, pushing her toward the house. "Get inside," he snapped, his hand already on his revolver. The scream had come from the corral, not the stable. He ran, his boots crunching in the snow. Elowen did not go to the house. She ran to the stable door, her heart frozen. Another whinny, this one choked off. Colt reached the corral. His horse, Brindle Jack, his best stud, was rearing, his eyes white. Another horse was down. No, not down. Loose! The corral gate was open. "Someone's here," he yelled. He raised his revolver, scanning the deep shadows by the windbreak. "They're on foot." He sprinted to Brindle Jack, grabbing his mane. The horse was trembling, his coat slick with sweat despite the cold. Colt looked at the tack rail by the gate. A bridle was on the ground. The leather reins had been sliced clean through, halfway down their length. It was not a theft. It was sabotage. A man who rode a horse with cut reins in this country, chasing strays in the dark, was a man riding to his death. The footprints, the confrontation, the cut reins. It was an escalation. Colt looked at the tracks, the same wide, heavy boot prints from the porch. They led away, up the ridge, toward the high, dark pines. Whoever it was, he had just left. He had been there, in the shadows, watching them in the barn. He had waited until they were at the house, at that doorway, lost in their own world. And then he had struck. "He's running Brindle Jack," Colt said, his voice a low, furious growl. "He'll founder him in this snow." "He's not just running him," Elowen said, her eyes fixed on the tracks leading toward the dark line of pines. "He's leading him. Look at the tracks. Brindle Jack is being led by another horse." Colt saw it instantly. The stud's tracks were paralleled by another set, shod and biting deep. This was not just sabotage. It was a calculated theft. "Stay here. Lock the door," Colt commanded, turning toward the stable for Marigold. "No." The word was absolute. Elowen ran past him, pulling open the stable door. "I'm going with you. He's not just after your horse." Colt looked at her, saw the terror in her eyes replaced by a hard, unyielding certainty. He did not have time to argue. "Marigold for me. The bay gelding for you? Saddle him, fast." She was a rancher's daughter. In less than 2 minutes, she was leading the gelding out, her small frame moving with a desperate efficiency. Colt was already mounted on Marigold, his rifle now snug in its scabbard. his revolver loose in its holster. He watched her swing into the saddle, her movements sure. She might be frail, but she was born to this. "Stay behind me," he said. "Just ride," she replied, her voice tight. They plunged into the night, two dark shapes against the snow, following the trail left by the thief. The tracks led straight up the ridge, into the dense, black forest of lodgepole pines. The world narrowed to a tunnel of blue-black shadow and silver-lit snow. The wind was a living thing in the trees, howling, sending down showers of powder that stung their faces. Colt was focused on the tracks, his eyes straining in the poor light. Elowen, riding just behind and to his left, closed her eyes. She did not need to see. She could feel the world. She felt the ground change beneath her horse's hooves. From the soft, deep powder of the clearing to the packed, treacherous snow of the animal trail. She felt the wind shift, a subtle pressure on her right cheek, and knew they were angling northwest. And she heard, beneath the roar of the wind, she heard the rhythmic, heavy breathing of their own horses. But ahead, farther than Colt could see, she heard something else, the panicked, explosive snorts of Brindle Jack, and the steady, confident gait of the horse leading him, and one other sound, a faint, metallic clack, irregular, a piece of metal, loose, striking a wooden saddle tree or a metal cinch ring. It was a sound of careless riding. "He's close," she said, her voice sharp, making Colt startle. "I don't see anything," he said, peering into the blackness. "To the left. He's leaving the trail. He's trying for the cut." Whisper cut. "He's insane. It's a box canyon. He thinks he can lose us." She urged her horse forward, pulling abreast of him. "I can hear his saddle. A loose concho or a ring. It's just ahead. Left." Colt trusted his eyes, but he had seen what she could do. He trusted her senses more. He pulled Marigold hard to the left, crashing through the low-hanging, snow-laden boughs. They burst out of the trees onto a narrow ledge. The world fell away into a deep, dark ravine. This was Whisper Cut. The wind screamed through it, a rising, furious shriek. And there, not 100 yards ahead, was the rider. He was struggling. He had Brindle Jack on a short lead, and the powerful stud was fighting him, terrified of the narrow path and the sheer drop. The thief was a large, heavy man. It was Dirk Mallory. "Heel, Jack!" Dirk yelled, his voice torn away by the wind. He saw them. He panicked. He drew his own revolver, turning in the saddle. He never got the chance. Colt's revolver was already out. The sound of the shot was deafening, a flat, hard crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The bullet did not hit Dirk. It exploded the rock face a foot above his head, showering him with ice and stone fragments. Dirk cried out, dropping his gun in the snow. He kicked his horse, trying to flee, but Brindle Jack reared, pulling the lead rope taut. "Let the horse go." "Mallory." Colt roared, his voice the command of a man who would not be disobeyed. Dirk was trapped. He looked at Colt, then at the sheer drop to his right. He let go of Brindle Jack's lead. "Now the knife," Colt yelled. "Drop it." Dirk's face was a mask of confusion and terror. "My knife, what?" "On your belt, the snake handle. Drop it, or the next one is for your hand." Dirk's hand went to his belt. He looked at the prized knife. He looked at the dark, unmoving shape of Colt Rafferty, his revolver arm steady as a fence post. With a curse, Dirk unclipped the sheath and threw it onto the path. But Elowen was not looking at the knife. She was looking at the small, oilskin pouch tied to Dirk's saddle horn. "The pouch!" she screamed, her voice a raw, broken thing that cut through the wind. "Colt, the pouch!" Dirk's eyes widened. He had forgotten. He had slipped into the house while they were at the barn, found her cot, and taken the one thing she owned. He spurred his horse. A desperate, foolish move. The horse, already spooked, leaped forward on the icy path. It scrambled for footing, its iron shoes striking sparks on the stone. And then its hind legs went out. The horse fell, sliding, but managed to regain its footing. Dirk was not so lucky. He was thrown from the saddle, his body spinning, and he slammed hard against the canyon wall. He cried out, a sharp, wet sound of pain, and lay still, his leg bent at an unnatural angle beneath him. His horse, terrified, galloped madly down the trail, disappearing into the falling snow. Colt was off Marigold in a second. He grabbed Brindlejack's lead, his voice low and soothing, calming the frantic stud. Elowen slid from her horse. She ignored Colt. She ignored Dirk, who was groaning on the ground. She ran, stumbling on the uneven path, to the fallen knife. She scooped it up. Then she ran to the spot where Dirk had fallen, her eyes searching the snow. There! The oilskin pouch had been torn from the saddle. She snatched it up, her fingers numb, her chest aching. She tore at the leather tie. Inside was a single, small piece of vellum, folded into a square. It was worn thin at the creases. The ink faded, but the lines were clear. It was a map, a simple, hand-drawn map of Hart Hill, showing the precise location of the underground spring. At the bottom, in her mother's elegant, faded script, were the words, "This is your water, Elowen, your inheritance. Do not let greedy men take it from you." She closed her hand around the map, her body shaking so violently she could barely stand. Her mother's voice, a memory she had clung to in the dark cellar, was suddenly clear in her mind. "They will try, baby girl, they will try, but you are smarter than them. You listen to the land. The land will keep you safe." Tears, hot and stinging, froze on her cheeks. She bit her lip until she tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood. She was not crying from sadness. It was rage, pure, cold, and cleansing. "Elowen!" Colt's voice was beside her. He had tied the horses and was standing over Dirk. Dirk was clutching his leg, his face pale with pain. "It's broke," he moaned. "My leg, it's broke." Colt nudged the leg with his boot. Dirk screamed. "It's not broken," Colt said, his voice void of all sympathy. "A bad sprain. Maybe you'll live." He looked at Elowen. She was standing tall, the map in one hand, the snakehead knife in the other. Her face was a terrifying mask of fury and vindication. Colt looped a rope under Dirk's arms. "Get up!" He hauled the whimpering man to his feet and half-dragged, half-lifted him onto the back of the bay gelding, tying his hands to the saddle horn. "You're riding," Colt said to Elowen, indicating Marigold. "I'll lead the stud. We're going to town." They rode into Red Hollow just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking the eastern horizon. It was a grim procession. Colt, mounted, leading the prize stud, Elowen, following, her face hidden in the collar of his coat, and Dirk Mallory, tied to his saddle, his head hanging. They stopped in front of the deputy's office. Colt's banging on the door brought Maeve Hollister out, her hair uncombed, her badge pinned crookedly to her nightshirt. "Rafferty, what in God's name?" Her eyes went from him to the girl, to the man tied to the horse. "Is he—" "He's alive," Colt said. "I found him on my land, trying to steal my stud. He'd already cut my reins." He untied Dirk and dumped him unceremoniously onto the wooden boardwalk. Dirk groaned. "He's a thief," Colt said. "He's a liar," a new voice boomed. Bram Kincaid had emerged from the mercantile, his face dark. "He kidnapped my ward. Mallory was just trying to retrieve my property." Elowen slid from the horse. She walked past Bram as if he were not there. She stepped up to Deputy Maeve. She said nothing. She just held out her two hands. In her right hand, she held the snakehead knife. In her left, she held her mother's map. Maeve looked at the knife. She looked at the map. Then she looked at Elowen's bandaged wrists. She had seen the rumors, heard the whispers. Now she was seeing the evidence. "Dirk," Maeve said, her voice suddenly all business. "Is this your knife, Dirk? Seeing Bram tried to bluster. She stole—" "Is it your knife?" Maeve repeated, her hand on her own sidearm. Dirk looked at Bram, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "No," Dirk whispered. Elowen stepped forward. She held the knife out, hilt first, to Bram. "Then it must be yours, uncle-in-law," she said, Her voice was a rasp, but in the dead silent street, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. Bram Kincaid recoiled, his face pale, as if she had offered him a live rattlesnake. "No," he said, his voice strangled. "I've never seen it." "Then it's evidence," Maeve said, taking the knife from Elowen's hand. She looked at the map. "And so is this." She took that, too. She looked at Colt, then at Bram. The town was waking up. The postmaster was watching from his window. The blacksmith, Orson Vale, was standing in his doorway. The tide was turning. The story was changing. "Bram," Maeve said, her voice hard. "You claim guardianship. Colt claims trespass and theft. Dirk here is injured. I'm holding this knife and this map as evidence in an assault investigation." She looked at Bram's face, at the hatred boiling in his eyes. "I suggest you go home. This will be settled by the circuit judge." "Not in the street." Bram stood there for a long count, his reputation, his power, unraveling in the cold morning air. He looked at Elowen, who met his gaze, unflinching. He turned, without a word, and stalked away. He had not won. He had been stopped. Colt helped Maeve drag Dirk into a holding cell. He gave his statement, his words brief and to the point. The ride back to Coyote Gate was silent. The snow had stopped, and the sun was a weak, white wafer in the sky. They were both soaked to the bone, their clothes frozen stiff, their bodies aching with cold and the adrenaline crash. They reached the cabin and tended to the horses first, their movements mechanical. They entered the house. The fire in the stove was almost dead, just a pile of glowing red embers. The room was freezing. Elowen went straight to the hearth, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable waves. She was not just cold, she was in shock. Colt fed wood into the stove, his movements quick, coaxing the embers back to life. Flames licked the dry wood, and a small, hopeful roar began. Elowen was trying to unbutton the heavy, frozen coat, but her fingers were numb. Useless. "Here," Colt said. He came up behind her. He pushed her clumsy hands aside and began to work the frozen buttons himself. He pulled the heavy, wet coat from her shoulders. She was shivering, her thin flannel shirt soaked through, plastered to her skin. He grabbed a rough wool towel from the shelf, the one he used for washing, and threw it over her head, his hands moving to her shoulders to rub warmth back into her. His hands were large and rough, and the friction was immediate, painful, and necessary. He rubbed her back, her arms. "You're frozen," he murmured. He was drying her hair, his fingers working the wool against her scalp. His hand, clumsy and large, slipped from the towel and his bare palm grazed the side of her neck, his thumb resting just below her ear, in the soft, vulnerable hollow of her throat. Elowen went utterly still. Her shaking stopped. Her breath hitched. His hand was so warm. It was the warmest thing she had ever felt. The calloused skin, the sheer size of it, the solid, living heat. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a point of contact, absolute and terrifying. He did not pull away. His hand stayed, his thumb moving, just once, a small, circular motion against her skin. She tilted her head back, her throat exposed, her eyes closing. A small, desperate sound escaped her. The fire in the stove caught a pocket of resin in the pine. It flared with a sudden, sharp whoosh, a rush of heat and light that filled the small cabin. And in the center of the room, two people stood, bound by a single touch, as a different, more dangerous fire flared to life in their chests. His hand was on her neck, her skin, where his palm and thumb rested, was a point of unbearable, searing heat. The rest of her body was still frozen, but that one point of contact held her entire consciousness. She could feel the hard calluses of his palm, the slight tremor in his fingers. He was as uncertain as she was. The stove roared, filling the silence. The flames a sudden, bright orange, mirroring the heat that shot through her. She did not pull away. She did not move. She simply stood, her eyes locked on the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. Her breath held tight in her chest. Colt's voice, when it came, was so low it was almost inaudible. A rumble felt more than heard. "Can I stay near you?" It was a strange question. They were already standing so close that the steam from her damp shirt was rising to meet his chin. But she understood. He was not asking about physical space. He was asking for permission to remain in this new, fragile, terrifying place with her. She tried to speak, to say yes, but her throat was locked, frozen from the ride and the scream she had unleashed on the trail. She managed only a single, sharp nod. Her lips, pale and chapped, trembled. The simple motion was enough. He did not move his hand from her neck, but his thumb, which had been still, moved in a slow, soothing circle against her skin. "You're shaking," he murmured. "You're still frozen. Sit by the fire." He released her, and the sudden absence of his touch made her feel cold again. He gestured to the low, three-legged stool she always used. She moved to it, her legs unsteady, and sat, turning her back to him, facing the fire. The heat from the open grate was a physical blow, stinging her face and hands. She watched the flames, her body rigid. She heard him move behind her. He did not use the towel again, it was too rough. He sat on the other stool, the one he used for mending tack, and pulled it close behind her. She could feel the warmth of his body at her back. A solid presence, a shield against the memory of the night. He held his hands out to the fire, the way a man does, rubbing them together, absorbing the heat. Then he lifted them to her head. He began to dry her hair. His fingers, calloused and scarred from rope and wire, were incredibly gentle. He threaded them through the long, damp strands of her hair, separating the tangles, holding the hair up to the radiant heat of the stove. His movements were slow, methodical. It was the same patience he used to gentle a spooked colt, the same steady confidence he used to mend a broken fence. It was an act of pure care. Elowen's eyes, which had been wide and staring at the flames, fluttered closed. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her, a breath she felt she had been holding since she was lowered into the cellar. Her shoulders, which had been bunched up around her ears, began to drop. The tension drained from her body, replaced by the profound, radiating warmth of the fire and the rhythmic, comforting motion of his hands in her hair. His fingers massaged her scalp, a slow, circular pressure that sent waves of heat down her spine. He worked the tangles free, his hands moving with an unpracticed, clumsy tenderness that was more moving than any practiced skill could have been. His knuckles brushed her ears, her temples. His touch was not a demand, it was a service. When her hair was mostly dry, his hands stilled. They rested on her shoulders, large and heavy, a comforting weight. She leaned her head back, an involuntary motion, resting against his arm. She felt him go still behind her. Slowly, Elowen turned on the stool. She turned to face him. He was closer than she realized. His knees were on either side of the stool, trapping her in a small, safe space. The firelight lit one side of his face, leaving the other in deep shadow. His dark eyes were fixed on her, his expression unguarded, unreadable. He looked at her, and she at him. In the silence, there was only the sound of the wind screaming around the cabin eaves and the sharp crackle of the stove. She, who had been silenced, felt the need to give him something in return, a wordless answer to his wordless care. She lifted her right hand, the one with the dirty linen bandage still wrapped around the wrist. She raised it, her arm trembling, and placed her palm flat against his chest. His shirt was thick, damp wool, but beneath it, she felt him jolt, a sharp intake of breath, and then she felt it, his heart. It was strong, steady, and powerful, a heavy, slow thump-thump that echoed under her palm. It was the rhythm of the ranch, of the solid earth, of the man himself. It was the most real thing she had ever touched. Colt closed his eyes, as if her touch were a pain or a pleasure too great to see. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest. Then he leaned forward. He did not try to kiss her. He rested his forehead against hers. Elowen's breath caught. Now, she was surrounded. The fire on her left, his body on her right. his hand covering hers, and his forehead pressed to hers. She could feel the steady pulse in his temple, a counter rhythm to the one beating under her hand. They stayed like that, motionless, for a full minute, simply breathing each other's air, their heartbeats and their breathing slowly falling into the same, shared cadence. The world shrank to this one small, warm, dark space. He pulled his head back, just an inch, just enough to see her. His eyes were dark, searching hers. He looked at her eyes, then down at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He lowered his head. The first kiss was a question. It was just the gentle, dry pressure of his mouth against hers. It was hesitant, uncertain, chapped from the cold wind. He was asking. Elowind gave him her answer. Her hand, which had been flat on his chest, slid up, her fingers curled, gripping the rough wool of his shirt, pulling him closer. She rose from the stool, just slightly, and her mouth, which had been passive, softened and pressed back against his. A low groan rumbled deep in his chest. That was all the answer he needed. His other hand, which had been resting on her shoulder, came up, his fingers lacing into her now dry hair, cradling the back of her head. He tilted her head, and the kiss changed. It was no longer a question. It was a statement. It was a deep, firm, claiming pressure. It was slow, and it was sure. It was not the fast, frantic kiss of boys. It was the deliberate, starving kiss of a lonely man. It was a kiss that spoke of long winters and silent suppers. It was the kiss of a man who had not allowed himself to want anything in a very long time. He was not taking, he was giving. He poured all the words he never spoke, all the comfort he never gave, all the profound, steady strength of his character, into that one, slow, certain kiss. Elowen melted against him. Her body, which had been a tightly coiled wire of fear, went slack. She leaned into him, all her weight, and he took it, his arm, the one that had been at her back, wrapped around her waist, pulling her from the stool and onto his lap, holding her tight against him. She was surrounded by him. His taste was of coffee and the cold night air. His smell was of wood smoke, leather, and the faint, metallic scent of the gun he had fired. She kissed him back, her small, trembling body pressing against his solid one. It was a kiss of profound, desperate gratitude. It was the kiss of a person who had been drowning in cold, dark water and had just been pulled into the sunlight. They broke apart, but only by inches, their foreheads resting together again. They were both breathing hard, their breath mingling in a shared cloud. Colt looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. He led her the 2 steps to the hearth and sat on the thick, dark bearskin rug that lay before the stove, pulling her down beside him. He did not let her go. He kept one arm around her waist, tucking her against his side. The heat from the stove was immense, washing over them. He looked into the flames, struggling for the words. "Elowen," he said, his voice rough. "This is hard country. This ranch. It's all I have. It's not much. It's just work and wind." He turned to look at her, his gaze so direct it was almost a physical touch. "But it is safe. I will keep you safe. I swear it." It was a vow, a simple, unadorned commitment, solid as the granite of the mountains. Elowen looked at him, at this quiet, hard man who had fought for her. The tears that had frozen on the trail, the tears of rage and terror, finally thawed. They welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring the sight of the fire. She did not sob. The tears just ran, silent and warm, down her cheeks. She smiled, a small, watery, broken smile. He saw the tears and his expression softened. He took her hands in his. He looked down at them, at the crude, dirty linen bandages, very carefully. He began to unwrap the bandage on her left wrist. The cloth was stiff, tacky with dried blood. He unwound it slowly, revealing the raw, red, abraded flesh beneath. The wound was a perfect circle, the shape of the sisal twine that had bound her. It was the mark of the cellar, the brand of her captivity. Colt stared at the wound, his jaw tightening. Then he bent his head. He pressed his lips, warm and gentle, to the raw, broken skin. It was a kiss that was not about passion. It was about reverence. He was kissing the wound itself. He was honoring the pain she had endured. Elowen gasped. A sharp, choked sound, and a sob broke from her. He had not shied away from her ugliest part. He had healed it. He moved to her other wrist. He unwrapped the linen and pressed his mouth to the raw flesh there. A silent promise to erase the past. A vow to protect her future. He pulled her into his arms, and she went, burying her face in the solid, warm wool of his shoulder. He held her as she wept, her small body shaking with the release of weeks of terror, of years of loneliness. He held her tight, one hand stroking her back in a large, steady circle, the other holding her head secure against his chest. He just held her. They sat like that, on the rug, in the pool of light from the roaring stove. The cabin was a fortress of warmth against the howling, lonely dark. The fire burned bright, casting their joined shadow on the log wall. His arms were a promise, and her hands, no longer bound, clasped his shirt, her shoulders, which had been hunched for weeks, finally relaxed. Her breathing, which had been panicked, slowed, falling into the same deep, steady rhythm as his. When the tears finally subsided, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion took their place. Colt felt the tension leave her body, her weight growing heavy against him. "You need to sleep," he murmured, his voice thick. He helped her to her feet and led her to the cot. She climbed in, her movement slow, her eyes half closed. He pulled the heavy wool blankets up, tucking them firmly around her chin, cocooning her in a way that was not a prison, but a protection. He stood over her for a long moment, a dark, guardian shape in the firelight. He looked down at her pale, exhausted face. "No one will lock you up again," he whispered, his voice a low, final oath, hard as iron. "Ever?" Elowen looked up at him, her eyes heavy. She believed him. She let her eyes close. Sleep took her instantly. It was not the gray, numb unconsciousness of the cellar. It was deep, warm, and safe. A few moments later, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her mouth. She had left the ham. She was a person who had been pulled from a dark, cold hole in the earth and laid by a hearth, in a kitchen that was bright with light, the warmth of the cabin, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a temporary truce. The fight had moved from the snow-covered range to the intangible, treacherous territory of paper and ink. Bram Kincaid had lost the physical confrontation. He would not make the same mistake twice. He returned not to Red Hollow, but to Cheyenne. He walked into the offices of a man named Slocum, a lawyer with a smooth face and a silk vest, who had come west not for the land, but for the disputes it bred. "He's armed, and he's hiding her on his ranch," Bram explained, his voice stripped of its pious tremor, leaving only the cold iron beneath. "He's poisoned her mind against me, her legal guardian." Slocum steepled his fingers. He had heard this all before. "Guardianship," he said, his voice a smooth, oiled mechanism, "is a claim of responsibility. Kidnapping is a claim of force. Both are messy. We must be cleaner." He leaned forward. "We pivot. We are not retrieving a ward. We are protecting an incompetent. We file for an affidavit of mental incompetence. We will argue that this girl, known for her eccentricities, is a danger to herself, that you and your Christian charity have been her protector. This man Rafferty has not kidnapped her. He is exploiting her." Bram nodded, seeing the path. "And the land." "Ah, the land." Slocum smiled. "Her claim is based on a piece of paper, an inheritance, but her father never filed for water rights. We, on the other hand, will file a claim of prior appropriation. We will argue that your livestock have grazed that hill, watered from that runoff, for 5 years, that your intent to use the water predates her discovery of it. With her declared incompetent, and your prior claim, the court will appoint a custodian of her assets. That," Slocum finished, "will be you." The news of the legal filing hit Red Hollow like a cold spring rain. Deputy Maeve Hollister rode out to Coyote Gate, her face grim. She sat at Colt's table, her hat in her hands, declining coffee. He's smart. Colt, or his lawyer is. They're not just coming for Elowen. They're coming for her mind. They've petitioned the circuit judge to have her declared unsound. Elowen, who had been listening from the hearth, went rigid. The old names, the whispers, touched, unnatural, unsound. He can't, Colt said, his voice a low growl. He can try, Maeve said. And the judge will have to hear it. We need more than that map. We need proof she is sound. We need a doctor. Elowen stood. She walked to the small chest where she kept the oilskin pouch. She took out her mother's map. Then she looked at Colt, her eyes clear and hard. My mother's things. The papers. Bram has them. In the attic. Her will, Colt said, understanding. Her inheritance papers. Even with a will, Maeve argued. Slocum will say she's too unstable to manage it. We need to fight the incompetence claim first. We need Dr. Linwood. Amos Linwood was a man of science, a small, precise man who believed in what he could see and touch. He seemed out of place in Red Hollow, with his spectacles and his quiet, academic manner. He agreed to see Elowen. Not in his office, but at the ranch. He said he wanted to see her in her element. He arrived on a Saturday, and they sat at the table. Colt stayed by the stove, saying nothing. Doctor, Linwood did not ask her about the cellar. He did not ask her about Bram. He asked about the weather. Reverend Pike said you knew about the blizzard last month, 2 days early. The doctor said, his eyes kind but keen. How? Elowen hesitated. She looked at Colt, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The horses, Elowen said, her voice quiet. They move to the low pasture. They stand with their backs to the northwest. They eat more. They get still. And, the doctor prompted, the air, before a big snow, the air smells like iron, and the wind, it stops. For an hour, maybe 2, the whole world just stops breathing. Doctor, Linwood nodded, making a small note in his journal. And the hot spring you found? Tell me about that. Elowen explained, her words mixing with the hand signs Colt had been teaching her. The signs gave her hands something to do, a way to channel the nervous energy. She explained the sound of the rotten post, the hollow bone whistle. She explained the patch of melted snow, the specific smell of sulfur, the way the steam was invisible until you were right on top of it. After an hour, Doctor, Linwood closed his journal. He stood and put on his hat. Mr. Rafferty, he said, this young woman is not incompetent. In point of fact, she is the most profoundly competent human being I have met in this territory. She is not touched. She is an observer, a skill most people have forgotten. You will have my affidavit in the morning. It will state, in no uncertain terms, that Elowen Hart is of sound, clear, and uncommonly sharp mind. It was a victory, but the town remained divided. Bram's story was a good one, a story of a pious man burdened by a crazy, ungrateful relative. It was a story people were comfortable with. Reverend Pike, caught between Maeve's evidence and Bram's long-standing tithes, preached a confused sermon on the afflictions of the mind and the duties of community. He urged caution. He advised prayer. He offered no solutions. The true test came not from a lawyer, but from the sky. A new storm, a late-season squall, blew in from the north with terrifying speed, catching the town by surprise. It hit in the afternoon, a wall of white that turned midday into dusk. A woman's scream cut through the howl of the wind. It was Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife. Her son, Thomas, a boy of 6, had been playing by the creek when the storm hit. He was gone. The men of the town, including Colt, gathered in front of the mercantile, pulling on heavy coats, checking their rifles. They were forming a search party. He'll be by the creek, one man yelled. He'll have followed it downstream. No, he'll have tried to come home, another shouted. We'll check the barns. Elowin, who had ridden to town with Colt, grabbed his sleeve. He looked down. She was standing in the lee of her horse, her face pale, her eyes closed, her head tilted. She was doing it. She was listening. Elowin, he said. She opened her eyes. They were focused, sharp. She pointed not south to the creek or north to the barns. She pointed east, toward the old, shallow stone quarry. She signed, her hands moving fast, her woolen gloves clumsy. Wind, from north. She made a pushing motion. It pushes him, southeast, the quarry, the rocks. He will hide from the wind. Colt did not hesitate. He did not ask questions. He yelled to the men. She says the quarry, the wind is pushing him there. The quarry that's half a mile east, one man argued. He'd never go there. Colt was already on Marigold. We're going. Elowin was on her gelding. They rode into the teeth of the blizzard. They did not search. They rode with purpose. When they reached the shallow, snow-filled bowl of the quarry, they could barely see their hands in front of them. Thomas Colt roared. Only the wind answered. Elowin slid from her horse. She put her hand on the ground, feeling the vibration. She walked to a large, overhanging granite boulder, tucked in the hollow behind it. A space almost completely drifted over with snow was a small, dark shape. It was the boy. He was blue, his body rigid, his eyes closed. He's not breathing, Colt said, his voice flat. Elowin pushed him aside. She ripped the heavy greatcoat from her own shoulders. She pulled the boy from the snow, laid him on the coat, and then lay down on top of him, wrapping the coat around them both, pressing her chest to his back, her mouth to his neck, breathing her own body's heat into him. Fire! She signed to Colt, her hand frantic. Now! Colt used his knife to shred bark from a pine, and with his flint, he fought the wind and the snow. He got a small, sputtering flame. They huddled behind the rock. Elowin a living blanket, Colt a human windbreak. They returned an hour later, just as the storm broke. Elowin, wrapped in a horse blanket, carried the boy, who was now conscious and crying, into the mercantile. She handed him to his mother. Reverend Pike had been part of the search party that had gone to the creek. They had found nothing. He stood by the stove, his face ashen, watching Elowin give the boy back. He saw the unnatural girl, the afflicted mind, wrap the child's cold hands around a hot cup of broth. He said nothing, but the next Sunday, his sermon was different. It was about the arrogance of pride and the sin of bearing false witness. It was about how sometimes the quietest, most unusual vessels hold the greatest wisdom. He never mentioned Bram's name. He did not have to. The legal case was weakening. But Bram was not done. The true leverage, Colt knew, was Dirk Mallory. He found Maeve at the jail. Dirk's been sitting for 2 weeks. Is he ready to talk? He's terrified. Maeve said, he's looking at 5 years in Laramie for the horse theft and the assault. He'll talk. The cell was cold. Dirk was huddled under a thin blanket, his arrogance gone, replaced by a sullen, rat-like fear. Bram's not coming for you, Dirk, Colt said, standing on the other side of the bars. I know that. Dirk spat. You'll be on the stage to Laramie when the circuit judge gets here. You'll be gone 5 years. Bram will have this whole thing settled by the time you're out. Dirk looked at the floor. What do you want? The truth. An affidavit. That Bram hired you to run us off. That he ordered you to cut my reins. That he hired you to intimidate Elowin. Dirk laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. An affidavit. My word against his, he's a churchman. I'm me. I need more, Colt said. I know he promised you something. A man like you doesn't risk Laramie for a few dollars. Dirk was silent. He looked at Colt, his eyes calculating. If I give you something real, will you speak to the judge for me? Tell him I cooperated. I'll tell him the truth, Colt said. Dirk nodded. That was better than a lie. He reached into his boot. Tucked into the leather was a folded piece of paper. It was not the original. It was a copy, scrawled on mercantile paper, but it was signed a promissory note. It promised Dirk Mallory 25% of all profits from the water rights on Hart Hill in exchange for services rendered in securing the property. It was dated 2 days before Colt had pulled Elowin from the cellar. It was a contract for a conspiracy. Colt took the paper. "I'll tell the judge you were helpful." The spring thaw came, not as a gentle melt, but as a violent rush. The snow receded, and the land, brown and sodden, reappeared, and with it, tiny, almost invisible shoots of green. The grass was returning. In town, a notice was posted, the annual spring fair, a day of horse trading, seed buying, and community. It was the first time the entire territory would gather. "He will be there," Elowin said. She was standing on the porch, watching the new grass. "He will," Colt agreed. "He will bring his papers," she said, her voice stronger. She had been practicing, speaking aloud to the horses, then to Colt. "He will try to make me sign, in front of everyone." "To show them he's right, to show them I am his." Colt nodded. "Then that's where we'll finish it." The work on the ranch changed. It was no longer just about survival. It was about preparation for a public fight. Colt taught Elowin the last of the signs he knew. Water, land, mine. Truth. Listen. She practiced. She stood by the new hot spring, which Colt had now capped with a small stone enclosure. She held her mother's map. She whittled a small model of the hill and the spring, showing how a trough could water an entire field. She practiced telling her story. Her hands, which had once shaken so badly she could not hold a cup, were now steady. They moved with a clear, sharp grace. Colt worked on the ranch yard. He mended every fence. He whitewashed the rails. He cleared the winter's debris. He was not just cleaning his property. He was setting a stage. He was preparing for an outdoor trial, a place where the conscience of the town would be the only judge. He was showing them what stewardship looked like. One evening, as the sun set, painting dry Cedar Bluff in shades of purple and gold, Elowin stood on the porch. Her hands were on the rail. She was no longer watching the ridge for enemies. She was watching the new grass grow. The church bell rang, not for a service, but for the start of the spring fair. It was a high, clear sound that promised new beginnings, a counterpoint to the thick, sucking mud in the town square. Wagons, their wheels caked with the thaw, were parked in a wide circle. Trestle tables were laden with seed sacks, jars of preserves, and bolts of bright calico. The air, for the first time in months, did not smell of just snow and wood smoke. It smelled of fried bread, damp earth, and horse. The people of Red Hollow gathered, stamping the mud from their boots, their voices loud. They were hungry for gossip, for news, for anything other than the sight of their own four walls. They traded, they laughed, but mostly they watched. They watched the entrance to the square. Colt Rafferty and Elowin Hart arrived just before noon. They came on horseback, but they did not ride in. They dismounted at the edge of the square and walked. Colt was a solid, immovable object. He wore his clean duster, his hat pulled low, his revolver holstered in plain sight. He was not a man of towns, and his presence was a statement. But it was Elowin the crowd watched. This was not the wraith of the rumors. She was thin, yes, but she stood straight. Her dark hair was clean, pulled back in a single, thick braid. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, mended and clean, and over it, a man's canvas work coat, taken in at the waist. She was pale, but her eyes, which had been downcast for so long, were clear and sharp. They scanned the crowd without fear. They did not stop at the tables. They walked to the center of the square, near the town's tall, whitewashed flagpole, and they waited. Their presence cut the noise of the fair by half. Deputy Maeve Hollister was already there, leaning against the mercantile porch, her arms crossed. Dr. Amos Linwood stood near her, his journal in his pocket. This was not a fair. It was an appointment. Then Bram Kincaid arrived. He did not come alone. He had Huck Veers with him, and his lawyer, Slocum, who looked profoundly uncomfortable in the mud. Bram was dressed in his Sunday suit. He was playing the part he had played for years, the town elder, the long-suffering guardian. He strode to the center of the square, stopping 10 feet from Elowin. He held up a sheaf of papers, his voice booming with false piety, loud enough for the entire town to hear. People of Red Hollow, I am here today not as a man, but as a protector. I hold in my hand an affidavit, filed with the territorial court, declaring my ward, Elowin Hart, to be of unsound mind, a danger to herself. A low, shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. This was worse than the whispers. This was a legal declaration. This man, Bram pointed a finger at Colt, who did not move, has taken advantage of her affliction. He has poisoned her mind. I am here, with the law on my side, to take her back to a place of safety. Elowin, child, it is time to come home. He held out his hand, his expression one of pained, fatherly concern. The crowd held its breath. This was the moment. Elowin stepped forward. Colt did not stop her. This was her ground. He is lying. Her voice was not a whisper. It was quiet, but it was clear, and it cut through the air like a clean blade. The square went utterly silent. Even the horses at the trading post seemed to stop moving. Bram's smile faltered. Child, you are unwell. You do not know what you are saying. I know exactly what I am saying. Elowin said. She unslung a leather satchel from her shoulder. From it, she took 2 documents. The first was her mother's small, vellum map. This is my land, my mother's map, showing the spring she left to me. A drawing. Bram scoffed, though a line of sweat had appeared on his temple. And this, Elowin said, holding up the second paper, is my mother's last will and testament, the real one, the one you hid in your attic. The crowd gasped. She held it up. At the bottom was a fresh, crisp, embossed seal. It was filed with the county registrar in Cheyenne 3 days ago. Elowin said, her voice gaining strength. It is a legal document. The land is mine. Bram's face went pale. The land was lost. But Slocum, his lawyer, stepped forward. A will does not matter if the beneficiary is incompetent, the lawyer said, his voice smooth. The court will still hear the affidavit. No, it will not, Doctor, Linwood said, stepping away from the porch. He held up his own paper. As a licensed physician, I have also filed an affidavit with the circuit judge. I spent 2 hours with Miss Hart. She is not only of sound mind, she is, in my professional opinion, one of the most keenly observant and intelligent individuals in this county. The crowd was turning. The murmurs were no longer confused. They were angry. He lied, someone whispered near the back. He tried to steal her land, another said. This is a private family matter, Bram yelled, his voice cracking. A dispute over land. No, Bram, Maeve Hollister said. She stepped down from the porch, her hand on her holster. It is not. Her voice, unlike Bram's, was calm and carried absolute authority. It's not just about land, it's about debt. She unrolled a long sheet of paper. This is a copy of the public ledger from the Mercantile. It shows you owe $800 to the Cheyenne Freighting Company, due this week. It shows you offered Elowin's land as collateral. A collective gasp. $800 was more than a man might see in a year. Bram was breathing hard, his eyes darting from face to face. He was trapped. And, Maeve continued, her voice cold as ice, it is about conspiracy. She pointed to the jail. Mr. Veers, open the door. Huck Veers, looking sick, fumbled with the keys and opened the cell. Dirk Mallory walked out, blinking in the bright sun, his hands cuffed in front of him. Dirk, Maeve said, do you recognize this? She held up the promissory note, a note signed by Bram Kincaid, promising you 25% of the water profits from Hart Hill, in exchange for services rendered. Maeve read the note aloud. The crowd was silent, listening to the anatomy of a crime. This, Maeve concluded, is a contract to terrorize a young woman and to steal property. This is a criminal conspiracy. Bram Kincaid was finished. His reputation, his piety, his standing in the community had all evaporated in that single, terrible moment. He looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw no sympathy. He saw only judgment. He was a fraud. He panicked. He did not lunge for Colt. He did not lunge for Elowen. He lunged for Maeve. "No!" he roared. A desperate animal sound. He was not trying to shoot her. He was grabbing for her gun, to fire it in the air, to scatter the crowd, to create chaos, to find any escape from the closing trap. His fingers clawed at her holster, but Colt was already moving. He had been waiting, his body coiled. He crossed the 10 feet in 2 long strides, a silent, dark blur. He slammed into Bram, his shoulder hitting Bram's chest like a sledgehammer. The 2 men crashed into the flagpole. The crowd screamed, scattering backward, tables overturning. Bram's hand was on the gun. Colt's hand was on Bram's hand. They struggled, their breaths grunting, their boots slipping in the mud. The gun came free from the holster, a dark piece of metal trapped between their bodies. It fell. It hit the hard-packed earth at the base of the flagpole. It landed on its hammer. The explosion was deafening. It was a single, flat, brutal crack that shattered the air. A woman shrieked. The bullet ricocheted off the stone base, screamed through the air, and slammed into the wooden porch beam of the mercantile, sending a shower of white splinters flying. Then, silence, a ringing, absolute, terrified silence. Colt was still pressed against Bram, his forearm against Bram's throat. Bram was frozen, his eyes wide, staring in disbelief at the smoking gun on the ground. The entire town was motionless, in the dead quiet. One person moved. Elowen. She had not screamed. She had not ducked. She had not even flinched. She had stood, rooted in place, and watched. Now, she walked. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She walked past Colt and Bram. She walked into the open, empty space in the center of the square. She stopped, and she turned. She faced the crowd. She faced the people who had whispered about her, pitied her, feared her. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed back the sleeve of her canvas coat. She held up her right arm, her hand high for all to see. In the bright, unforgiving spring sunlight, the scar was vivid. It was not a faint line. It was a raw, red, puckered circle, the brand of the sisal rope, the mark of the cellar. She held it up. She turned, her arm high, showing it to the north, the south, the east, the west. She showed it to Reverend Pike. She showed it to Mrs. Gable. She showed it to the hard-faced ranchers who had doubted her. Then she spoke. Her voice was not the rasp of the cellar, nor the whisper of the cabin. It was strong. It was clear. It shook with the force of her will. But it did not break. "No one," she said, her voice ringing across the silent square. "No one will lock me up again." The silence that followed was different. It was not fear. It was shame. A farmer near the front took off his hat, his gaze dropping to the mud at his feet. The woman who ran the post office, who had spread the first rumors, covered her mouth, her eyes wet. Reverend Pike stepped forward. His face was ashen. He looked at Elowen, at the scar, and then at Bram, who was now weeping silently, pinned against the pole. "Child," the Reverend said, his voice thick. He placed his hand over his heart. We have been blind. We have allowed a great sin to fester in our town, in our silence. I ask your forgiveness." Maeve Hollister, her face like stone, picked up the fallen revolver. She holstered it. She took out her handcuffs. She walked to Bram, pulled Colt away, and spun Bram around, forcing his hands behind his back. "Bram Kincaid," she said, her voice clear. "You are under arrest." The sharp click of the cuffs echoed in the square. Maeve turned to Dirk. "Dirk, did he hire you?" Dirk looked at the defeated man. He looked at the 5 years in Laramie. "Yes," he said, his voice dead. "He hired me. It was all him. He wanted the water." Maeve nodded. "Huck, get them both in the cells." The public trial was over. The crowd began to breathe again, the murmurs starting up, low and ashamed. Colt Rafferty had not moved. He had watched it all. He had watched Elowen face down her demon, and the towns, with nothing but her voice and her scar. He walked to her. He ignored the stares of the crowd. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He did not pull her into his arms. It was not a moment for that. It was a moment of respect. He simply stood before her, and he held out his calloused, scarred hand, palm up. It was the same gesture he had used at the cellar door. Not a command, an invitation. Elowen looked at his hand, solid and steady. She looked at her own, the scar still burning. She took a breath, and she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. It was not the grip of a rescuer holding a victim. It was the grip of a partner, solid, firm, unbreakable. They stood together in the center of the muddy square, their hands clasped, while the town of Red Hollow watched. It was a quiet victory, hard won, and absolute. The light, held in the smallest, most silent vessel, had finally, irrevocably, burned away the dark. The trial in the square did not end the winter, but it broke its power. As the snow receded, the land, which had been a uniform white, revealed itself in shades of brown and gray. Scarred but healing, the mud in the ranch yard dried, and the wind, which had been a bitter enemy, softened, carrying the smell of damp pine and the promise of growth. The change in the town was just as slow, just as profound. The whispers about Elowen Hart did not stop, but their nature changed. They were no longer accusations. They were apologies. Coyote Gate Ranch became a place of quiet pilgrimage. First, it was the children, Mrs. Gable, whose son Thomas Elowen had pulled from the snowdrift, was the first. She arrived one afternoon, holding the small boy's hand, a basket of fresh bread in the other. He won't stop talking about you, Miss Hart. Mrs. Gable said, her eyes still holding the shadow of shame. He keeps asking, "How did you know?" Elowen looked at the boy, who was hiding behind his mother's skirt, peeking at her. She knelt, getting on his level. "I listened," Elowen said, her voice still soft, but sure. "You just have to listen." "Listen to what?" the boy asked, stepping forward, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. "To the wind," Elowen said, "and the ground, and the way the trees hold their breath." By the next week, Thomas had brought 2 friends. They sat on the porch steps while Elowen taught them. It was not a class with books. It was a class in observation. "Close your eyes," she would say, and the 3 small children would squeeze their eyes shut, their faces screwed up in concentration. "Now, feel the wind. Is it from the north, where the snow lives, or the west, where the rain comes from?" "It's from the north," Thomas said. "It's cold on my left ear." "Good." She smiled. "Now, smell it. Does it smell like iron? For a blizzard, or just clean?" They learned to hear with their skin. They learned to tell the difference between the sound of ice that was thick and safe, and the high, singing sound of ice that was about to break. She was giving them the tools of her survival, turning her curse into their protection. Colt, mending a bridle by the stable door, would watch them, the hard lines around his mouth softening. He was watching her reclaim her own story, turning the narrative of the unnatural girl into the teacher of the natural world. The second visitor was Maeve Hollister. She rode up not as a deputy, but as a friend. She had papers in her saddlebag, official documents from Cheyenne, crisp and smelling of ink. "It's done," Maeve said, accepting a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. The judge threw out Bram's incompetence claim, citing Dr. Linwood's affidavit. "Bram, he'll be in Laramie for at least 10 years. Conspiracy, assault, fraud." They threw the book at him. "And Dirk?" Colt asked, leaning against the doorframe. "He turned state's evidence. His testimony about the promissory note sealed it. He'll get 2 years, maybe less for cooperation. He'll never set foot in Red Hollow again." Maeve pushed another, heavier document across the table. "This," she said, tapping it, "is the most important part. The land is yours. Elowen, the title is clear." Elowen traced the embossed seal with her finger. And the water, Maeve continued, a rare smile on her face. The spring, your mother's map, combined with Dr. Linwood's report on the hot spring here, has made the county sit up. They've legalized your claim. The water rights for Hart Hill are yours. But, she added, Reverend Pike, in a fit of newfound conscience, proposed something. The town council voted. They've asked if you'd be willing to place the spring in a community trust, not to sell, but to share, to ensure no man like Bram can ever use water as a weapon here again. Elowen looked at Colt. He gave a single nod. It was her choice. She looked back at Maeve. Water, she signed, her hand moving to her chin. Then she made the sign for share, a flat palm moving over the other. Then she spoke. Water is for everyone. The work on the ranch began. It was not the frantic, defensive work of winter. It was the slow, hopeful work of spring. They were not just mending, they were building. There was a small, cold tack shed near the stable, its roof half caved in. It had been a dark, forgotten space. Together, they tore it down to its foundation and rebuilt it. They salvaged the good timber, and Colt cut new planks, the air filling with the clean, sharp scent of fresh pine. Elowen wanted a window, a big one, facing south. Colt framed it, and they hauled the glass back from town. It was a room for her, a place to store the herbs and plants she was beginning to collect, a place to sit in the sun. It was a warm room, a deliberate antithesis to the cold, dark cellar. One afternoon, Colt returned from the hills, a set of shed elk antlers tied to his saddle. He sat on the porch for hours, drilling small, precise holes, sanding the bone smooth. He hung the pieces from a piece of weathered cedar with strips of raw leather. He hung it from the eaves of the new warm room. It was a wind chime, but it made no high, tinkling sound. When the spring breeze moved through it, the heavy antlers knocked together with a deep, sonorous, hollow sound, a sound like distant, peaceful drums. It was the sound of the mountains, a sound of peace. That evening, the work was done. The sun was low, turning the sky a violent, beautiful orange. Saddle Marigold, Colt said. And the gelding, I want to show you something. They rode west, away from the ranch, climbing the high ridge that separated the lowlands from the high prairie. They rode for an hour, the horses breathing hard, until they reached the summit. It was a place Colt had always kept for himself. The locals called it Prairie Glass Ridge. The wind here was constant, and it had polished the native fescue grass until it lay flat, rippling in the gusts like a river of dark, shining water. From here, you could see everything, the entire curve of the valley, the small, distant lights of Red Hollow, and the dark, jagged line of the mountains to the west. They dismounted, standing at the edge of the world. The wind was loud, but it was a clean, rushing sound. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun bleed away. This was my mother's place, Colt said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. She used to say it was the only place she could breathe. He turned to Elowen. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Elowen, he said. He cleared his throat, and she realized he was nervous. This man, who had faced down 5 guns, was nervous. I'm not a man for fancy words. You know what I am. This ranch, this wind, it's a hard life. He paused, searching. This house is small. The winters are long, but I find I do not wish to face them alone anymore. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. The new room is good, but the roof on the main house needs mending, and I was wondering if you would let me build a roof for 2. It was the most practical, most beautiful proposal she could have imagined. A roof, a shelter, a shared home. Elowen did not speak. The wind had taken her tears. She simply lifted her hand, the one with the faded red scar on the wrist, and laid it against his rough, wind-chapped cheek. He was so solid, so real. She leaned in, and she nodded, just once, against his skin. He let out a long, shuddering breath he seemed to have been holding since the day he broke the lock. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing it to his face. He bent his head, and she rose on her toes. The kiss was not like the first one, the one of frantic heat by the fire. This kiss was slow, deep, and steady. It held the promise of a lifetime. It tasted of the wind, and it smelled of the high, clean prairie, of sun on dry grass and leather. They rode back in the dark, their hands brushing. When they arrived, a light was on in their cabin. Orson Vale, the blacksmith, and his wife were sitting on their porch. Orson's wife, a kind, round woman named Elspeth, held a pie tin wrapped in a towel. We saw the light," Elspeth said, her voice nervous. "We wanted to, well, Orson and I. We are sorry. Miss Hart." Orson, who could not speak, lifted his hand. He signed, "We were wrong." Then he pointed at her, and signed, "Brave, good." Elowen looked at the pie, a dark, bubbling apple pie, the crust perfect. She looked at these people, who had once shunned her, now sitting on her porch, offering an apology. "Thank you," Elowen said, her voice thick. "Please, come in." That night, for the first time, they had guests for supper. Later, long after their friends had left, Elowen did one last thing. She took a single tallow candle and a match. She did not light it in the warm cabin. She walked outside, onto the porch, and sat on the top step, facing the darkness. She struck the match, the flare of sulfur sharp in the cold night air, and lit the wick. She did not shelter it. She just sat, her arms wrapped around her knees, and watched the flame. It was a small, solitary point of light against the vast, dark prairie. The wind blew, and the flame guttered, bending low, threatening to go out. It danced, it fought, it struggled, but it held. She watched it until the wax pooled and the flame burned steady, a bright, defiant spear in the night. She was not a prisoner watching a lamp in the damp. She was a free woman, guarding a light on her own porch. She sat there until the candle had burned itself out, and then she went inside, closing the door on the cellar of her memory for the last time. Colt was standing by the stove, the fire banked low. The room was warm, filled with the comfortable, lingering smell of coffee and baked apples. He did not speak. He just held out his hand. She took it. He drew her to the center of the room. There was no music. There was only the low moan of the wind in the chimney and the deep, resonant call of the antler chimes outside. He put his hand on her waist, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and they began to dance. It was a slow, shuffling waltz, their boots brushing the pine floor. He led her, his movements simple and sure. She followed, her body light, fitting against his as if it were made to be there. They moved around the simple room, from the stove to the table, past the cot that was now her own, their bodies moving as one. He spun her, slowly, and pulled her close. He stopped dancing and just held her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the clean scent of her. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet reverence. He bent his head. He kissed her forehead, a kiss of protection. He kissed her cheek, a kiss of affection. He kissed her eyelids, closed now, a kiss of peace. Then he took her right hand. He lifted it, turning her arm over. His gaze fell on the scar, pale and silvery now in the dim firelight. He lowered his head, and he pressed his lips to the healed skin. It was a kiss of absolution, a kiss that erased the last shadow of the sisal rope, a kiss that said, "You are whole, you are safe, you are respected." She gasped, a soft, trembling sound, and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him tight. He held her, his arms a fortress, their breathing the only sound in the warm, safe, silent house. The next morning they were woken by a new sound, a frantic, high-pitched whinnying. Colt was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. Elowen was right behind him. They threw open the door, expecting danger, The sun was just breaking, painting the prairie in shades of rose and gold. In the main pasture, the mares were gathered, and running among them, their legs spindly and unsure, were 3 new foals, racing in wild, joyful circles. Sparrow, the young colt, was running with them, bucking and playing, a self-appointed guardian. It was the first sign of the new season. The future had arrived. Summer came not as a visitor, but as a resident. It settled over the high prairie, baking the mud of spring into hard, cracked earth and curing the new grass into a vast, rolling sea of pale gold. The wind lost its bite. It became a carrier of scents, warm dust, sweet clover, and the dry, herbal smell of sage. In the long, hot afternoons, the only sound was the high, thin zinging of crickets, a noise so constant it became a new kind of silence. The porch of the Coyote Gate Ranch had changed. It was no longer a defensive lookout, a place to watch for enemies. It had become a classroom. The children of Red Hollow, having survived the winter, now came to Elowin to learn how to survive the land. They would sit on the porch steps, their boots dusty, while Elowin sat in a rocker. Thomas Gable, the boy she had pulled from the snow, was always the first to arrive. She did not teach them letters or numbers. She taught them the language she had always known. She had a small piece of slate, and she would write on it with chalk. Today. The lesson was simple. Today the wind is kind, she wrote. We will be kind. How do you know it's kind, Miss Elowin? Thomas asked, his voice still holding a trace of his winter fear. Elowin put the slate down. She held up her hand, palm facing the breeze. Close your eyes, she instructed. The 5 children on the steps squeezed their eyes shut, their faces screwed up in concentration. Hold out your hand, she said. 5 small, dirty hands went up. Now, listen, not with your ears, with your palm. Does the wind push, or does it just touch? The children were silent for a long, long minute. It's just touching, a little girl whispered, her eyes still shut. It's warm. That is a kind wind, Elowin said, her voice soft. It means no storm is coming. It means the hawks are flying high, and you are safe to play by the creek. A kind wind means a kind day. They were learning the language of the earth, a language their parents had forgotten. They were learning to read the world not as a threat, but as a story. Colt, mending a bridle by the stable door, watched them. He watched her. She was no longer the pale ghost from the cellar. The sun had found her face, dusting her nose with freckles. Her voice, which had been a rusty, broken thing, was now clear and steady. He watched her turn the very thing that had seen her imprisoned, her unnatural sensitivity, into a gift for the next generation. He, too, had been building. He had found a massive, ancient cottonwood tree at the edge of the home pasture, a tree that offered the only real shade for a mile. With the same patience he used to gentle a horse, he had built a bench beneath it. It was not fine carpentry. It was solid, made of thick pine planks, sanded smooth with a piece of broken glass, and braced to withstand 100 years of wind. Every evening, as the sun began its long, slow descent, painting dry cedar bluff in shades of bruised purple and orange, they would sit there, shoulder to shoulder. They did not talk much. They had never needed to. They would just sit, breathing in the cooling air, and look out at the long spine of the ridge. It was no longer a place of threat. It was just the horizon. Maeve Hollister rode out one Tuesday, not with a warrant, but with an envelope. She sat with them on the new bench, sipping cool water from a tin cup, her deputy star catching the last of the sun. It is official, she said, tapping the envelope against her knee. The circuit judge has handed down the sentences. Elowin went still, her hand finding Colt's. Bram Kincaid, Maeve read, was sentenced to 15 years hard labor at the territorial prison in Laramie for conspiracy to defraud, assault, and false imprisonment. Given his health and his age, he will not be coming back to Red Hollow. Elowin let out a breath she felt she had been holding for her entire life. Dirk Mallory. Maeve continued. had his sentence reduced to 1 year for his full confession and testimony. He'll serve it and be released back east. He is barred from this territory for life. Maeve handed the envelope to Elowin. And this, the land, the Hart Hill deed is officially and irrevocably in your name. The original will, the one Bram hid, was all the proof the court needed. And the spring? Elowin asked, her voice quiet. That, Maeve said, with a rare, true smile, is the best part. The community trust is ratified. Your mother's spring. Elowin now belongs to the town, to everyone. The county is even sending an engineer to help pipe it. No man will ever be able to leverage it for power again. It belongs to the grass and the people. That night, Elowin went out onto the porch alone. The air was cool and sweet, the sky a vast, deep, cloudless ocean, punched through with 1,000,000 stars. The crickets were a soft, roaring fire in the darkness. She closed her eyes, just as she taught the children, and she breathed in. She smelled the high, dry grass. She smelled the distant, cool pine from the mountains, and underneath it all, she smelled the simple, profound scent of peace. She heard no footsteps, but she felt him, a sudden warmth at her back. Colt's arm slid around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He did not speak. He just rested his chin on the top of her head. She relaxed instantly, her body melting back into his arms a familiar, strong circle. They stood as one, a single, dark shape against the starlight, breathing in the same, clean air. The wind's shifting, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her hair. Smell it. It's coming from the south. Means a dry spell is coming. We will need to check the west fence line, she murmured, her eyes still closed, her mind already seeing the land. And the water level in the creek. We will, he agreed. He held her tighter. When the wind changes, we change the fence. She smiled, her face pressed against his rough cotton shirt. She finished their small, shared creed. And when the storm comes, we build a bigger fire. It was their only vow, the simple, durable, unpoetic rule of their life together. It was all they needed. Later, in the kitchen, the fire in the stove banked low, casting a soft, amber glow on the pine walls. He turned to her. The dishes were washed. The cabin was quiet. He held out his hand. It was the same gesture, the one at the cellar door, the one in the town square, their tradition. She took it. He drew her to the small, open space in the center of the room. Again, there was no music. There was only the low, distant song of the antler chimes on the wind, a deep, hollow beat, and the steady chirp of the cricket who lived under the hearth. He put his hand on her waist, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and they began to dance. It was a slow, shuffling waltz, their boots brushing the wooden floor. He led her, his movements simple and sure. She followed, her body light, fitting against his as if it were made to be there. This was not the dance of discovery, of fire and fear. This was the dance of deep, quiet knowledge. This was the dance of home. He spun her, slowly, and pulled her close. He stopped dancing and just held her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the clean scent of her, the smell of sun and soap. She leaned her head against his chest, her arm looped around his strong neck, and she listened. She listened to the slow, steady beat of his heart. The dance slowed to a stop, but they did not let go. They just stood, holding each other by the warm stove, breathing in time. Elowin pulled back slightly, just enough to look at him. She looked down at her own hands, which were resting against his chest, in the dim, amber light. She traced the scars on her wrists. They were no longer the raw, red, puckered marks of her captivity. They were pale, thin lines, like silver threads woven into her skin. They were no longer a brand of shame. They were a map of where she had been, and a testament to the fact that she had survived. She lifted her hand, the one with the faded map of her past, and she placed it flat against his chest. She felt it, the steady, slow, powerful beat of his heart, the sound of his life, the rhythm that had become her own. He covered her hand with his his large, calloused hand over her small one, pressing her palm against his heart, sharing the rhythm, holding her there. She looked up at him, her eyes clear, reflecting the low firelight. "I belong in the light," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. Colt looked down at her, his gaze holding all the reverence of the vast, silent prairie sky. He bent his head and kissed her forehead. "And the light," he answered, his voice rough with an emotion he would never name, "belongs to you." The heavy, plank door of the cellar, deep in the earth of her past, had finally, truly, swung shut. It was bolted not by a rusty padlock, but by a shared life. It was covered in earth, and new grass was growing on top. It would never open again. Instead, the kitchen door, the one on the Coyote Gate Ranch, stood open. It opened every morning to the rising sun, and on the stove, the fire was always lit, and two enamel cups always sat, side by side, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the people who had, at last, learned how to listen. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and show your support by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.